This is the second of two lectures on the Timbuktu narrative. The introductory part of this lecture is on part one, and we're tracing the historical development of this genre of European imperialist travel literature. In the first lecture, we discussed Alexander Gordon Laing's trip to Timbuktu, Mungo Park's trip, which he didn't make to Timbuktu, but visited the Joliba, Niger River, and also Rene Caillet's successful visit to Timbuktu. In the second lecture, we're going to look at the travelers that came after them, that therein solidified this genre, which, as I said in the last lecture, is very much not a thing of the past. Although the Timbuktu narrative, in a generic sense, is was established in the late 18th century, the 19th century. It persists into the 20th century and even into the 21st century. So we see a proliferation of narratives of usually white European travelers or American travelers who travel to Timbuktu as this fabled place that is believed to be some kind of magical El Dorado. And what gives them coherence in a generic sense is the goal of reaching Timbuktu. They all roads lead to Timbuktu, as Lady Dorothy Mills will say in her Timbuktu narrative. And so it's a problematic narrative in many respects, but it's one that remains very much alive even today. Part of this is because of the mystique that Timbuktu continues to have in the imagination of Western readers, despite the fact that this image, which, as we said in the last lecture, was established, began to be established when Leo Africanus wrote his narrative description of Timbuktu many, many years ago, hundreds of years ago. It nonetheless continues to this day, despite the fact that it has very little to do with the actual people who live in the city and the actual culture that's there. So this is very much in the Orientalist sense of Edward Said, a literature that is not really, doesn't tell us that much, or it tells us relatively little about actual African peoples themselves, although it does have some things that we can learn about African people through it, but really tells us more about the travelers themselves who venture in often quite narcissistic ways to this place in northern Mali. Now, that's not really the case, I would argue, and with respect to, I think, who everybody would agree is the greatest of the travelers of the 19th century, and that's Heinrich Barth, who lived from 1821 to 1865. Although he is the greatest of the explorers, he's perhaps also one of the most obscure. In some ways, he's a victim of his own success because his work is so thorough and it's so detailed that it tends to appeal really only to specialists. And yet, this is one of the exceptional cases of the travel literature that is, Barth was very accurate. He was obsessed with accuracy. He was a linguist as well. And so he captured a lot of information. And although there are lapses in his judgment in terms of we all, I think, have our own prejudices and biases based on our own particular cultural upbringing, whatever that may be. And that shines through at places. And yet, remarkably, he is relative, at least to other travelers. He's far more objective, and continues to be praised to this day for the accuracy of the information that he recorded. Now you can see here his travels and discoveries in North and Central Africa, published are recounting his journeys between 1849 and 1855, a 6-year journey where he essentially disappeared. People thought he was dead. Came out in a multi-volume publication. You can see here that it was a 5-volume publication of more than 3,000 words. So it was a massive work. And it remains very difficult even to find copies of it today because it remains obscure. But you can see when it was first released, the first 3 volumes, only 2,250 copies were printed, and then volumes that the interest tapered off because of what many people perceive to be the dryness of the prose. And so volumes 4 and 5 only 1,000 copies of it were produced and yet are printed. And yet, for specialists in the field, for those who are really interested in the history of Africa, this is an indispensable document that gives us very detailed glimpses into Central Africa, what he's calling Central Africa, which includes Timbuktu. Now, this is a Timbuktu narrative as well, because Barth did make Timbuktu the central objective of his travels, and or one of his central objectives, and he did make it to Timbuktu, and he lived to tell the tale. So he was the second traveler after Rene Caillet to go to Timbuktu and to come back alive to tell the tale. Now, what's worth noting also is that Barth was German, even though his travelogues are written in English. His command of English was very strong. He was an amazing linguist. He was very, very good with languages. He trained with Wilhelm von Humboldt. And so, Humboldt was an important German philosopher who was interested in languages and was really one of the first philosophers to argue that languages themselves embodied particular worldviews that in and of themselves were valuable. And so one of the reasons why Barth valued the African languages that he encountered and documented in his travels was that he had accepted Humboldt's views about language linked to the question of ways of understanding the world or viewing the world through a particular lens. So languages were not just in that sense a means to communicate. They for Barth implied a particular way of seeing the world, of thinking about the world, and this had the effect of validating not only African languages, but African ways of perceiving the world. Of course, his impact was, again, quite limited. It was limited to specialists. Now, you can see here, here are some images from his travels in the illustrated drawings. The drawing in the center was the drawing from his room where he was held for a long time in Timbuktu. He didn't really get to see much of Timbuktu outside of his room. He was held there essentially in a kind of a captivity, and he was finally allowed to leave, and to leave with his life, in part because he impressed those who held him with the thoroughness of his knowledge of Islam and with his sympathies with the views of those who he spoke with, and with the way in which he was able to, in many ways, show that he understood the religion of Islam often far better than those with whom he spoke. And this was very impressive to those whom he spoke with. Now, in Timbuktu today, you can see below there's a plaque on the room where he stayed, and there on the left bottom is an image of the door outside the room where he stayed in Timbuktu. And so he was honored by by those who encountered him, because they were simply impressed with his understanding, his knowledge, and his grasp of religion and languages. So he was indeed a quite impressive figure. Now Barth went to Africa along with what's called the Central African Mission from 1849 to 1857. And he was accompanied by James Richardson and Alfred Overweg. Now, both Richardson and Overweg died on this mission. So the three of them went together on this mission. Barth was the only one who returned alive. Now, Richardson was he was a very strongly Christian, and he was motivated by abolitionist sentiment. So for Richardson, his desire to come along on this mission was to help promote the abolitionist cause. Overweg, by contrast, was he's often, he wasn't really very diligent in his preservation of his notes. He was something of an adventurer, but he did not. He didn't preserve very good notes, and then he fell ill and died, and so didn't and ended up not making much of a contribution. I would note that Barth was also German, and so he was a German that was accompanying Richardson, who was the leader of the mission, on a British mission. Now, after Richardson died, Barth became the head of the mission, and finally he was the only one. But it was so here you had a situation where a German scholar was there to promote British interests. Now, here are some of the official objectives of the mission. It had four main objectives. One was to open up a regular and secure mode of communication across the Sahara from the Mediterranean to the Niger. So there was this, again, the Niger River. So there was this desire to establish a secure mode of communication over the Sahara, the desert, the formidable barrier that the Sahara Desert itself proved for so long and still remains today somewhat of a formidable obstacle. The extinction of the slave trade and slavery through persuading Africans to cultivate exchange of goods with Europeans. Okay, so remember again, while the slave trade persisted in the Americas, it had been abolished in England at this time. And part of their goal, as was true of the mission of Hugh Clapperton, was to continue to do what they could to eradicate the slave trade. Now, for Barth, this was part of the reason why he was there, but Barth was more of a scholar as opposed to Richardson, who was a more of an evangelical abolitionist, and they disagreed on the priority of abolition. Now, Barth was in favor of abolition, but he didn't think of it as his primary mission in the way that Richardson did. For Barth, this other objective, to collect information about African languages, geography, ethnography, and culture, was a higher priority for him. And then to quote unquote morally enlighten degraded Africans. This was, again, this white man's burden type ideology. So this was despite the fact that Barth was relatively speaking a more objective kind of observer of the cultures that he encountered. Let's not forget it was finally an imperial mission that he was on, and it did imply a kind of a European superiority. And this shimmers. You'll find instances of this in Barth's prose as well. And here's what Barth said. He said, the exploration of Central Africa should be made the principal object of the mission rather than for abolition, disagreeing with Richardson, instead of the secondary one as had been originally contemplated. He says, however, my admiration of the wide extension of the British over the globe, their influence, their language, and their government was such that I felt a strong inclination to become the humble means of carrying out their philanthropic views for the progressive civilization of the neglected races of Central Africa, and thus to spread commerce and civilization in all directions into the very heart of the continent. So this gives us some sense of how he saw himself and what he was doing. And again, it's interesting that he felt compelled to help extend the British influence, British imperialism, even though he was not himself a British citizen, but a German. He says, my chief object has been to represent the tribes and nations with whom I came into contact and their historical and ethnographical relation to the rest of mankind. This is, again, that Humboldtian mission that he acquired in his study at the universities in Germany, as well as in their physical relation to that tract of country in which they live. If in this respect I have succeeded in placing before the eyes of the public a new and animated picture, and connected those apparently savage and degraded tribes more intimately with the history of races placed on a higher level of civilization, I shall be amply recompensed for the toils and dangers I have gone through. Okay, and so again, note there, placing the history of these, what he calls these races here, on a higher level of civilization. This indeed was a laudable dimension of his mission. because he, like, for instance, Leo Frobenius, who was also a German who became very interested in the study of Africa and wrote a very famous book, African Civilization. He suggested that Africa was a place of a kind of a high civilization, and something that, again, I say kind of a high civilization because there was still a pejorative perspective implied in what he was about. And yet he did see African culture as offering a civilization at a time when many people did not. Okay. He said, I cherish the well-founded conviction that along this natural high road, the Niger River, European influence and commerce will penetrate into the very heart of the continent and abolish slavery, or rather those infamous slave hunts and religious wars, destroying the natural germs of human happiness, which are spontaneously developed in the simple life of the pagans and spreading devastation all around. And then here you get a sense of his perception of himself. We think of this in terms of what we called in our last lecture, the anti-conquest, as theorized by Mary Louise Pratt. He says this is how he thinks of himself. We Europeans were excellent people, trustworthy and full of religious feelings, who had no other aim but the welfare of mankind, universal intercourse, and peaceable exchange of goods. Now, this is certainly how he thought of himself, and yet there's no doubt that his detailed knowledge that he produced was indeed used by the British to further their imperial objectives in this part of Africa. All right, so in the aftermath of the publication of Barth's great work, here are some. I'll just give you some samples of some evaluations of his prose, or how he was received. Here's Bovell in the Journal of African Society. It says, his or Barth's spirited defense of his own faith and his profound knowledge of both the Christian and Muslim religions won him the respect of the more cultured citizens, so that he came to no physical harm. So there's a description of indeed what took place in his travels, and I'll show you an instance of this in just a moment. But here's Bovell also, and he speaks. His views are echoed by others as well, because you really have to be somewhat obsessed with this part of Africa to get through all 5 volumes. He says, in truth, his writings make dull reading for anyone who has no particular interest in the country they describe, but are mercifully available in a less cumbersome edition than the 5-volume one of more than 3,000 pages. And here's W.F. Gowers. He says, I have never found him, Barth, at fault in any detail whatsoever, whether geographical, ethnological, or linguistic. His accuracy is perfectly marvelous. And this was indeed the case. Long after the time of Barth, even today, his texts can be used to provide very precise information about still relatively obscure parts of the Sahara Desert that very few have explored or traveled in. Here's another evaluation. His observations stand unexcelled in the annals of the exploration of Africa. He is the greatest of explorers, but also the most neglected. A perusal of contemporary scholars, makes one marvel at the authenticity and accuracy of his work. It seems quite clear that Barth was the greatest of the explorers who scoured the Western Sudan in the 19th century. The thoroughness and accuracy of his geographical work still stand unimpeached. Indeed, this is true. Here's another comment. Barth's revelation of the existence of written records in Africa and a high standard of learning proved that Africa was not the dark continent, a continent with no history or civilization until white men came. So this is worth pausing on for just a moment, because we've said that, for instance, Timbuktu was a great center of learning and is famous throughout Africa for its university life and for its many manuscripts. And even today, we said there's some 300,000 to 900 Timbuktu manuscripts in Mali. They're still being counted and evaluated. But it took until Barth was really the first one to understand that that this part of Africa had vast, extensive written records, and to take them quite seriously, and to read them and to bring back knowledge of them to Europe. And this was in itself, remarkable at the time. Okay, now Barth he spoke, he selected 24 languages and dialects. He wrote down 196 words from the 24 languages and dialects that he explored, and phrases in each of these languages, and made some very interesting comments. And his linguistic studies, as Bohan notes, were epic making. In fact, he made extensive word lists. I mean, he was tireless in his study of all those he came across in the years that he spent wandering alone in the Sahara, in which people in England thought he was dead. They had even forgotten that he existed, and were quite surprised. I mean, I think there was an obituary even that was written of him, and it turned out he was indeed not dead at all. So here you can see the path of Barth's travels throughout Central Africa. You can see he ends up in Timbuktu, and he comes around. He traveled so extensively. Here are also some images taken from the text that he produced, of the places that he saw, bringing back insights of what this world that was quite unknown in Europe looked like. And you could just pause on that for a moment and see, what kind of world it was that he had wandered into. All right, now I mentioned that Barth was a Protestant Christian, but his knowledge of religion, including Islam, was quite extensive, and this knowledge on more than one occasion saved him from being killed or coming to some kind of harm, because he very mumuch impressed those he encountered with his knowledge, particularly of Islam. Here's one instance of this. A man called him a kafir, we should say like an unbeliever. And he says, "I confessed to the man who called me a kafir that with regard to the unity of the divine being, Islam certainly was somewhat purer than the creeds of most Christian sects. And I acknowledge that just at the time when Muhammad appeared, Christianity had sunk considerably below the level of its pristine purity." And the old man went away pleased with what I had told him, and swore that he would not call the English kafirs anymore. All right, so again, he as a Protestant, one of the strategies that he adopted, and I think he was also, but for him it wasn't merely a strategy, he truly believed it, was that he saw there being affinities between Protestant Christianity and Islam, and he agreed with those Muslims with whom he spoke about the Islamic critique of Christianity, but only insofar as it applied, let's say, for instance, to the Catholic interpretation of Christianity. But he insisted that the Protestant interpretation of Christianity was the accurate one, and was the right one. He said, here's another instance. "I told Sidi Muhammad that I was a real Muslim myself, the pure Islam, the true worship of the one God, dating from the time of Adam and not from the time of Muhammad. I likewise added that even they themselves regarded Plato and Aristotle as Muslims in effect, and thus I myself was to be regarded as a Muslim too, in a much stricter sense than these two pagan philosophers. I concluded by stating that the greater part of those who called themselves Muslims did not deserve that name at all, but ought rather to be called Mohammedan, such as we named them, because they had raised their prophet above the deity itself." Sidi Muhammad was not able to say a word in his defense. Now, this idea of what he calls Muslimini would be more like the notion of somebody who was Muslim in the sense that Islam affirms all people are Muslims, but their parents make them into Jews or Christians. And he's saying, in effect, that he too should be regarded as Muslim, in the sense that he was also in this a believer in the one true God in the lineage of Adam, Noah, and the prophet Abraham. Now here he is speaking to a Fulani chief from Gundam. He says, Barth to a Fulani chief from Gundam who reproached al-Bakai, who was the sovereign leader at Timbuktu at this time, who offered Barth his protection. And this was because there was Ahmadu and of the Massina Fulani wanted to have Barth killed, and al-Bakai would not allow that to happen. So there were others who wanted Barth killed as well. So part of the reason why al-Bakai put Barth into this secluded room in Timbuktu was for his own well-being, so nobody would kill him. And so there was this Fulani chief who said, why are you protecting Barth to al-Bakai? And Barth says, I impose silence on him by showing him how little he himself knew of religious matters and calling me an unbeliever. They entered into warm dispute with me upon the subject of religion, but soon found themselves so perplexed that they left it to the Sheikh or al-Bakai to answer all my objections. And then he adds, a Protestant Christian may easily defend his creed against these children of the desert, as long as they have not recourse to arms. All right. So in other words, if you're a good Protestant like Barth and you find yourself in a religious discussion with those who live in this part of the Sahara, you're going to be okay. You're going to get along if you stick to your guns. But so long as they don't, what I mean by stick by your guns, as long as you defend your faith earnestly and comparatively, so long as you're not killed before that happens. Okay, now here you can see, if you look at the image in the middle, you can see where the Massina Empire based at Hamdallah was, where Ahmadu, the son of Sekou Ahmadu, was installed at this time as sovereign. He lived from 1830 to 1862. He was later beheaded at the hands of El Hajj Omar Tall when the Tukulare Fulani came into that part of Mali. Ahmad al-Bakai al-Kunti, he lived from 1803 to 1865. He was the one who offered his protection to Barth because Ahmadu wanted Barth killed. And so you can see Timbuktu at the very edge of that Massina Empire. And Ahmadu and al-Bakai had entered into a kind of alliance with one another. In fact, when Ahmadu was fleeing from El Hajj Omar Tall, he was fleeing on the Niger to Timbuktu, hoping that he could find protection there from al-Bakai. So even though Ahmadu wanted Barth dead, al-Bakai would not allow this to happen because he was so impressed with Barth. He spared him his life, unlike in the case, say, of Alexander Gordon Lang, whose execution was ordered by Muhammad Bello from Sokoto area. Barth came away with his life in part because of his, respectful intelligence and his orientation to these religious matters, in which he was able to show that he understood Islam, and that he was himself, in some sense, a believer as well, or a believer of the religions of the book, who should not be subjected to harm. And you can see there again also on the left, these are the ruins of Hamdallah in central Mali, which is the place from which Ahmadu ruled. Okay, Barth, when he arrived at Timbuktu, as I said previously, Barth was really the first traveler to understand the wealth of literature that existed in this part of Africa. And he also was the first European to get a look at the Tarikh el-Sudan, which he read in Timbuktu. Now, he was not able to bring it back with him, but he was able to read parts of it. Now, he wrongly attributed the authorship of the Tarikh al-Sudan to Ahmad Baba, who was the great scholar for whom the Library of Timbuktu is named. It was actually written by Abd al-Sadi, who lived from 1594 to 1656, who was a Berber or Tuareg, chronicler. And John Hunwick in 1999 published his English language translation, if you're interested in reading this. But Barth read this, and it was really an eye-opening read for him, because he got this account of the Songhay dynasty of the Askias, and he began to understand the fact that there was this wonderful and great empire that had existed in the medieval period that was extraordinarily complex, and that there were other manuscripts in Timbuktu as well. And so he includes or incorporates into his own travel narrative the account of what he read in the Tarikh al-Sudan. Although he didn't read all of it, he read a good portion of it. And so he reported back the history of the Songhay dynasty of the Askias, which would have been in the medieval period from a European perspective, of what he had learned. And he brought this knowledge back with him, but he was not able to bring the Tarikh al-Sudan back with him. And here's what he said about the Tarikh al-Sudan. He says, "I myself was so successful as to have an opportunity of perusing a complete history of the kingdom of Songhay from the very dawn of historical records down to the year 1640 of our era. Although unfortunately circumstances prevented my bringing back a complete copy of this manuscript, which forms a respectable quarto volume, and I was only able, during the few days that I had this manuscript in my hands during my stay in Gondo, to make short extracts of those passages from its contents, which I thought of the highest interest in an historical and geographical point of view." And so now these manuscripts first came upon the radar of the Europeans who were aware who became increasingly aware of the ancientness and the literacy of this culture. These annuals, according to the universal statement of the learned people of Negro land, were written by a distinguished person of the name of Ahmad Baba. Okay, not in fact. Baba, by the way, was a scholar who was taken he was forced into exile in Morocco for a number of years after the Moroccans sacked Timbuktu, but he was allowed to come back. He was indeed a great scholar and jurist. Many works are attributed to him, but this was not one of them. It was written by Abd al-Sadi. It says, "Although in the work itself that individual is only spoken of in the third person, and it would seem that additions had been made to the book by another hand. But on this point I cannot speak with certainty, as I had not sufficient time to read over the latter portion of the work with the necessary attention and care." So he was mistaken in this regard. Now, you can see there on the left the Ahmad Baba Institute in Timbuktu, which includes lodging for visiting scholars who want to come and study the manuscripts. And there in the center is Ahmad Baba himself, or a painting of him, who lived from 1556 to 1627. As I said, he was forced into exile for many years in Morocco, but he impressed. Muli Ahmad Mansour was the pasha who had held him in captivity, but he impressed his captors so much with his knowledge that they finally let him return. And then you can see there on the right some manuscripts on the shelves of the Ahmad Baba Institute in Timbuktu. Now, in 1896, Felix Dubois published a book called Timbuktu the Mysterious. Now, Dubois was a French entrepreneur, and his book came in the aftermath of the French conquest of Timbuktu, when the French took Timbuktu after the devastating civil war that broke out between El Hajj Omar Tall and Ahmadu that devastated the region and allowed the French to come in and fairly easily colonize the region. So he came in and he wrote about it, and he followed up on many of the insights of Barth, and he was able to successfully procure a copy of the Tarikh al-Sudan, which then he had copied and brought back with him to France. And he wasn't a scholar in the way that Barth was, but he was an interesting figure. And he recorded a lot of information that he gives us a very clear image of what was taking place in this part of Africa at that time. And he became even more aware. I mean, for the first time, Europeans, France in particular, really now understood for the first time the extent of the manuscripts that were there and were present in Timbuktu. And so when Dubois he went to Djenné and he went to Timbuktu, and when he went there, he spent a lot of time, documenting the existence of these manuscripts. You can see there, one of the interesting things about his volume as well is that are the images that accompany it. He brings back a very vivid picture of what this part of the world looked like. And you can see there on the left, the mosque at Djenné. It's one of the most beautiful adobe mosques in the world. In fact, it probably is. It's big, it's enormous, and it's very impressive. Still there, the Grand Marché at Djenné is right in front of it. And Dubois had this theory even before Sheikh Anta Diop that Djenné was a lost city of the ancient Egyptians, and so he advanced this hypothesis that Djenné was, which is in fact one of the oldest continuous cities in the history of Africa. Some people at the diggings at Djenné say it is the oldest continuous civilization in West Africa, not just in West Africa, in Africa in general, because the diggings there show that it goes back very, very far indeed, that more than 2,000 or 3,000 years, perhaps. But he was so amazed by what he saw in Djenné, and he spoke so respectfully and wonderingly at the culture that he encountered, and he felt that he had walked into a remnant of ancient Egypt. So Djenné is kind of the sister city on the Niger of Timbuktu, and he spent a significant amount of time there before he went further north into Timbuktu and gathered a copy of the Tarikh el-Sudan. And here's what Dubois had to say about Timbuktu. He said, "This is Timbuktu, the holy, the learned, that light of the Niger, of which it was written, we shall one day correct the text of our Greek and Latin classics by the manuscripts which are preserved there." And then here's another quote. He says, "Lieutenant Boiteau took possession of Timbuktu in the name of France, and the tricolor was hoisted in the town for the first time by one of his sailors. Now, if ever, we might say it was written." And so Dubois has this sort of interesting take on it. I mean, at one point he says that he's going to produce a Tarikh for the Tubab. Now, the Tubab is the West African word for white people, and so he says he's going to write a Tarikh for the Tubab, which is to say a history for the white people of this region. And so what Dubois does as well is he incorporates much of the history of the Songhay dynasty that he learns about from his time in Timbuktu and Djenné, reading the manuscripts that he found. And at first they hide the manuscripts from him, but then they brought them out and he read them once they learned of his reverence for the manuscripts. And here's what Dubois had to say on Timbuktu's libraries. "The libraries of Timbuktu may be said to have included almost the whole of Arabian literature. Amongst other trades, the city made a specialty of manuscripts. The learned doctors were, to use an expression which may appear strange when applied to Negroes, bibliophiles, book lovers. In the best sense of the word, be it understood, they had no mania for collecting uncut books and bindings, but were true lovers of books." And he was a true lover of books as well, and so he went and shared his love of books with those whom he encountered. "Timbuktu reserved all her strength for the intellectual, and here her domination was supreme. The city became the religious, scientific, and literary center of the Nigerian regions." And this is indeed true, because, for instance, in the case of the Songhay dynasty of the Iskiyas, Gao was the administrative capital, but Timbuktu was really the place where it was like a university town. It was where the learning took place. Timbuktu was not merely the great intellectual nucleus of the Sudan. that is to say, of the Negroes. She was also one of the great scientific centers of Islam itself, her university being the younger sister of those of Cairo, Cordova, Fez, and Damascus. Her collection of ancient manuscripts leaves no doubt upon the point and permits us to reconstruct this side of her past in its smallest details. And this is indeed true, that the universities of Timbuktu, the libraries, centers of learning that were there were really connected in this network of Islamic universities that included Cairo, Cordova, Fez, Damascus. And oftentimes books would be exchanged between these different centers of learning. Students would choose to go to one place or another, much like students today choose the university that they prefer to go to. And Timbuktu was quite high on that list. In fact, oftentimes people would come and be find that they weren't prepared, and they would go away and then come back later because the learning was so extensive there. He says, and then he says, here, let's see another interesting quote. He says, I am now going to show the taking of Timbuktu, when the French taking of Timbuktu, and he's speaking as a Frenchman, in a new light as it appeared to the inhabitants. Why did they not write more books, was the question I asked. And they replied, for the last 100 years, there have been nothing but war and ruin. We have only known peace since the arrival of the French. Okay, so let's be aware then that part of what's going on in this text is that Dubois is trying to justify the French imperialism in West Africa, and so he promotes this kind of notion that that the French were welcomed in West Africa because they brought peace and prosperity, as opposed to the time of war, a civil war that prevailed prior to the coming of the French. And so he presents this very rosy picture of how happy everyone is to see the French arrive on the streets of Timbuktu. And he quotes another person. He says, peace reigns among us, since the French came. This one person is reputed to say to him, we can travel without fear. A child knowing the way may walk alone along the roads. When we meet others stronger than ourselves, they seized us and made us their slaves. The weak village was at the mercy of the powerful. But today all are equal and contented, and one may not do wrong unto another. It is to the white man that we owe this. And dost thou still ask why we are satisfied with the French, that is, presence, and wherefore we rejoice in it? Dost thou not now understand why the country submits unto thee and is peaceful? Okay, now putting this in historical context, remember again, the Europeans didn't get into this part of Africa until very late. And there was a terrible civil war between, or you could say called a sectarian war, between the Massina Fulani, who were Qadria Muslims in Hamdallah, in central Mali, and the Tukulere, who were Tijani, led by the jihadist El Hajj Martal, who came into the region and got into this conflict with, and they were. It was really tragic because not only were they fellow Muslims that were at war with one another, they were even members of the same ethnic group. They were all Fulani. It was Fulani killing Fulani, Muslim killing Muslim, and it was a power struggle between Ahmadu, the same figure who wanted Barth to be killed, as I mentioned previously, and El Hajj Martal. And so in the aftermath of this sectarian war, the French just kind of stood back and watched while this conflict took place. And then after all of this sort of war was going on, the French, again, always adopted this divide and conquer mentality. Then they just kind of came in, and it was very easy for them to take control of this area. But that sectarian conflict between between Ahmadu and El Hajj Martal is certainly not characteristic of the longer history of this region. But this was indeed the case at the time that Dubois came there. But Dubois is also very anxious to justify the French presence and to present this image, which is false, that everybody was so pleased that they were being colonized, which is simply not the case. But he is documenting the beginning of the French imperial presence in this part of West Africa. Okay, now our final traveler that we'll look at is Lady Dorothy Mills, who wrote a book called The Road to Timbuktu, which took place which was published in 1924. She lived from 1889 to 1959. This is a notable contribution to the genre of the Timbuktu narrative, because, in large measure, because it was a woman, a British woman, who went. But by this point, we get this sort of this. This is also an instance of this idea that it's going to the ends of the earth, and it becomes this adventurous place to go. Although the true exploration had really already taken place, and yet it is very interesting because we get the perspective of this part of Africa in this narrative genre. In any case, from a woman's perspective, we get a slightly different image, and it's quite interesting to compare how Mills sees this part of the world with the male travelers who have seen this part of the world as well, who preceded her. And she does indeed bring many unusual and interesting observations to bear. And she's a very gifted writer, and produced other literary works too. She called her trip there a trip to Neverland. She wrote, "Going to Timbuktu is a chance to realize dreams and gratify pig-headedness." And that's really what it becomes in the aftermath. Let's say if we think about the 20th century Timbuktu narrative, it becomes, there's a lot of posers out there who write these stories about how brave they are by going to this exotic place. And this is we could think of this as sort of the genre in decline, but it reiterates that same kind of journey, and it presents itself as the narrative. The conventions of the genre present themselves as this, bold and brave adventure traveling to the ends of the earth. But I want to note too, it's interesting that a lot of the discourse of the Timbuktu narrative, the male travelers present, frankly, eroticized images of the women whom they encounter. And here we find Mills doing effectively the same thing, but she's describing the men that she sees. Here's an example. She says, "We passed hundreds of native laborers engaged in felling and transporting trees, naked except for a few inches of rag. They were the most magnificent physical specimens I have ever seen. Over 6 feet, broad shoulders, lean flanked, superbly muscled without being thick set. Almost any of them might have served as a model for Hercules or Apollos of old Greek sculpture." So there she is, getting quite excited by the men that she sees when she's traveling, and she presents them in this sort of frankly sexualized descriptions of them. Here's another description. I think that this is interesting because she's really, I did an extensive study of these narratives some years ago, and this was the first traveler who spoke at length about what she smelled. All of the male travelers they speak in sort of relentlessly visualist terms, but Lady Dorothy Mills likes to talk about what she smells in her travels, and this is interesting and different. Sometimes when walking or riding through the bush, my nostrils have been assailed by some smell vaguely familiar. Sniffing inquiringly, I come to the conclusion that the smell is goats. Possibly a little later, I trace the smell to its source. It is not goats, or rarely and never exclusively. It is more. Okay, so there's the Tuareg. And the Tuareg, she describes, like other travelers, she has very hostile descriptions of the Tuareg. Because I came to hate the smell of karité. The bird of karité is it's a plant that grows there and has a very particular smell to it. But she hates the smell. She says, "I hate the smell of karité as I never hated putrefying sheepskins, dead dogs, or bad fish. At moments, it became a nightmare. To the sensitive nostril, all countries have their own individual smell, and that of the Sudan is karité." So she's very sensitive to smell, and she likes to write about the things that she does smell. And she also notes the sounds. And I think this is interesting too, because you don't hear, in terms of sensual description, You get a lot, again, as I said, visual description in the male travel logs, but in this travel log written by Lady Dorothy Mills, you also get this. She documents the things that she hears too. She says, "It was a curious feeling, but after a few days, as I lay in bed in Timbuktu, I felt I knew as if I knew Timbuktu intimately. I felt as if I knew her by her voice, or rather by the multitude of voices that together make up the voice of Timbuktu, of the Sahara, of Africa herself. Not by sight, for I had seen nothing of her." And here's another sensual description of what she hears. She says, "The sound of pounding millet is surely the most characteristic sound of West Africa. As the smell of karité to my dying day, if by chance I ever smell it again, will lay before me a vision of Africa, so also will the sound of pounded corn or anything else that has to be pounded in a big wooden bowl with a wooden pestle." Okay, now unfortunately, it's interesting in Mill's narrative. She's pretty. She's not. It's not an overwhelmingly racist narrative, but there's one chapter where she just. It's almost as if someone asked her to include a chapter filled with racial stereotypes, because she includes a chapter that is just, it kind of ruins the whole book for the readers if you're coming to it. Today. Here's, for instance, I'll give you just one example of her racism. She says, "Throughout my travels, I have always rather liked the Negro in his proper place." Well, there you have it. "I have always found Negroes easy and pleasant to deal with in my wanderings. They have a natural simplicity that makes them easier than the brown and more subtle and mentally complicated races." She means by that, again, the Moor, the Tuareg. "But as soon as one ceases to consider them as grown-up people and treats them as rather forgetful and naughty but likable children, they are all right." And so, again, it's unfortunate that she would include such poisonous descriptions, but they are there, and they do reiterate. This is something like we saw, for instance, in the descriptions of Mungo Park. And indeed, the Timbuktu narrative is marked by its racism. It is an imperialistic, racist literature, which is why, as I said in the last lecture, it has instigated the need to negate the negation, to put it in Faninist terms, and why post-colonial writers found themselves in the first instance, as always, having to undo these kinds of racist depictions that they find in the literature of European travelers. I'll just give you one instance of this in Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, when the hero of that novel, Okonkwo, ends up hanging himself after the coming of the British colonizers. Achebe rather ironically says that he has a British traveler comment on Okonkwo's suicide, and says, "Well, this might make an interesting footnote in his travel log." And it's that kind of Achebe's interest in undoing the racism that he sees, or in negating that negation that he has found in European travel literature, that motivates much of the early post-colonial literature that is produced in the early days of decolonization. All right, so here are some questions for further consideration. We'll conclude on this note. These are some things to consider. What are the generic features of the Timbuktu narrative? Who is the audience, and what are its unarticulated expectations? What are the recurring themes that define the genre? And I'm thinking of genre here along the lines of, a kind of a social contract between the reader and the author of the text, that are the expectations that the reader brings to the text and that the author satisfies. And indeed, a full-flown genre emerges here, but many of these generic features are not articulated. So I'm asking you to think about the aspects of these texts that don't come to be articulated, but that are implied in each and every instance. Is the Timbuktu narrative akin to what Edward Said calls Orientalism, beyond questions of the author's overt racism? So we can think of it in this sense as being unified by what Said calls these idées reçues that repeat themselves over and over again, much like the one that we just saw in Mills, that echoes almost exactly what we find in the writing of Mungo Park and other travelers. And then finally, how do European, British, French, German orientations to writing and our literacy differ from African ones? These are all questions worthy of consideration as we think about the historical development of this genre.